Rich man saves hitchhiker in rain, then freezes when he discovers her true identity. Alexander Reed sat behind the wheel of his Bentley, navigating the rain-slicked roads of upstate New York with practiced ease. At 45, he had everything money could buy: a successful investment firm, a mansion in the Hamptons, and a lifestyle most people only dreamed of. Yet on nights like this, when the rain drummed against the windows and the world outside felt impossibly dark, the emptiness of his success weighed heavily upon him. Born into old money, Alexander had spent his life proving he was more than just a trust fund kid. He had turned his family's modest fortune into an empire, earning a reputation as one of Wall Street's shrewdest investors. His success came with a price, though. 2 failed marriages, no children, and a growing sense of disconnection from the world around him. The latest copy of Forbes magazine lay on the passenger seat, his face on the cover under the headline, "The Modern Midas, Alexander Reed's Golden Touch." The irony wasn't lost on him. Everything he touched turned to gold, but gold couldn't warm an empty house or fill the silence of solitary dinners. Tonight, he was driving back from a charity gala in the city, another event where he had written a large check and made the expected appearances. The rain had started just as he left, and now, 2 hours into his drive, it had become a deluge. He should have taken his driver, Charles, but lately he had taken to driving himself, finding a strange comfort in the solitude of the open road. The windshield wipers worked furiously against the downpour as his headlights cut through the darkness. The GPS showed at least another hour to his Hampton estate, but Alexander was in no hurry to return to its hollow grandeur. He had just rounded a particularly treacherous curve when his headlights illuminated a figure on the side of the road, a young woman, drenched to the bone, thumb extended in the universal signal for a ride. In her other hand, she clutched what appeared to be a battered backpack. Common sense told him to drive on. In this day and age, picking up hitchhikers was asking for trouble. He had read enough stories about robberies and carjackings to know better. Yet something about the desperation in her posture, the way she seemed to shrink against the rain, made him hesitate. Little did Alexander know that his decision in the next few moments would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about success, happiness, and the true meaning of wealth. The Bentley's brakes responded smoothly as Alexander guided the car to a stop several feet ahead of the hitchhiker. Through his rearview mirror, he watched as the young woman approached cautiously, her figure distorted by the rain streaming down the windows. He pressed the button to lower the passenger window, letting in a gust of cold, wet air. The woman leaned down, and Alexander got his first clear look at her face. She was younger than he had initially thought, probably in her mid-20s, with striking green eyes and dark hair plastered to her face by the rain. Despite her bedraggled appearance, there was something dignified about the way she held herself. "Thank you for stopping," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I know it's a risk these days." Alexander found himself nodding. "Where are you headed?" "Anywhere away from here," she replied, then seemed to catch herself. I'm trying to get to Portsmouth. There's a shelter there that might have a bed for the night." The mention of a shelter made Alexander reassess his initial impression. This wasn't just someone caught in the rain, this was someone who had run out of options. "That's more than 2 hours away," he said, "and in this weather." He hesitated, then made a decision that went against every instinct of self-preservation he had developed over his years in business. "Get in. I have a place in the Hamptons. We can figure out your next move once you're dry." The woman's eyes widened with a mix of hope and suspicion. I can't pay you." "I'm not asking you to," Alexander replied, reaching over to open the passenger door. "I'm Alexander Reed." A flash of recognition crossed her face at the name, but she quickly masked it. "Sarah," she said simply, climbing into the car. "Sarah Foster." As she settled into the leather seat, Alexander noticed she was shivering. He adjusted the car's heating and reached into the back seat for a blanket he kept there for long drives. "Here," he said, handing it to her. "You must be freezing." Sarah accepted the blanket with trembling hands, wrapping it around herself. The Forbes magazine slid off the seat as she moved, landing at her feet. She picked it up, looking at his face on the cover before carefully placing it back on the dashboard. "You're him," she said quietly. "The investment guy. The one they call the modern Midas." Alexander grimaced slightly at the nickname. "That's what they call me," he acknowledged, putting the car back in drive. "Though I've never been particularly fond of the comparison. Because everything Midas touched turned to gold, but he couldn't eat or drink, and he nearly killed his daughter?" Sarah asked, surprising him with her knowledge of the myth. "Exactly," he replied, glancing at her with renewed interest. "Most people just focus on the gold part." They drove in silence for a few minutes, the rain creating a hypnotic rhythm on the roof. Alexander had questions, many of them, but something told him to wait. Sarah seemed to be gathering her thoughts, her fingers absently tracing patterns on the blanket. Finally, she spoke. "I should warn you, I might be in some trouble." "Nothing illegal," she added quickly, seeing his expression. "But complicated. If you want to drop me off somewhere, I'd understand." Alexander considered her words carefully. His rational mind told him to stop the car now, to let her out at the next gas station with some cash for a bus ticket. It would be the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. But as he looked at her reflection in the windshield, something else entirely came out of his mouth. "I'm good with complicated." Sarah's eyes met his in the darkness, and something passed between them, an understanding, perhaps, or the beginning of one. Neither of them could have known in that moment how their lives were about to intertwine, or how this chance encounter on a rainy night would change them both forever. As the Bentley continued through the storm, Alexander felt an unfamiliar sensation, a mixture of anticipation and unease, as if he had just set foot on a path that would lead him far from the carefully ordered world he had built for himself. The drive to Alexander's Hampton estate took longer than usual due to the weather, giving him time to observe his mysterious passenger. Sarah had fallen into a fitful sleep, the blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. In sleep, her face lost its guarded expression, revealing a vulnerability that tugged at something deep within him. As they approached the gates of his property, Sarah stirred awake. Her eyes widened as she took in the sprawling mansion, its windows glowing warmly against the dark sky. "This is where you live?" she asked, her voice small. "Home sweet home," Alexander replied with a touch of irony, though it's probably seen more corporate retreats than actual living lately. As they pulled into the circular driveway, Alexander's housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, appeared at the front door, clearly concerned by his late arrival. Her expression shifted from relief to surprise at the sight of Sarah. "Mrs. Chen?" Alexander called out as they hurried through the rain. "Could you prepare the blue guest room? And perhaps find some dry clothes?" The housekeeper nodded efficiently, leading Sarah upstairs while Alexander went to his study. He needed a drink and time to think about what he'd gotten himself into. 20 minutes later, Sarah appeared in the doorway, wearing borrowed pajamas that made her look even younger. Her hair was wrapped in a towel, and her feet were bare. She hovered uncertainly at the threshold until Alexander gestured for her to enter. "Thank you," she said, perching on the edge of a leather armchair. "For everything. I know this must seem crazy, taking in a complete stranger." "Sometimes crazy is exactly what we need," Alexander replied, surprising himself with his honesty. "Would you like to tell me what you're running from?" Sarah's fingers twisted in her lap. "How did you know I was running?" "Experience," he said simply. "I've seen enough people running toward things and away from things to know the difference." She was quiet for a long moment, then reached for her backpack, which Mrs. Chen had dried. From it, she pulled a worn envelope. "I'm running from this," she said, handing it to him. Inside, Alexander found newspaper clippings about a prominent tech company, Quantum Dynamics. The articles detailed a massive fraud scheme that had cost investors millions. But it was the last piece that caught his attention. A small obituary for David Foster, a whistleblower who had died in a car accident just days before he was scheduled to testify. "David Foster," Alexander said slowly, looking at Sarah. "Your father?" She nodded, tears filling her eyes. "He tried to do the right thing, and they killed him for it. I found his evidence, everything he had gathered about the fraud. That's why I'm running. They know I have it, and they're looking for me." The revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow. Quantum Dynamics was one of his firm's major investment partners. He had met their CEO, Marcus Sterling, just last week at a charity event. As he processed this information, Alexander realized he was no longer just a good Samaritan helping a stranded traveler. He was now entangled in something far more dangerous, a conspiracy that had already claimed one life and threatened another. Looking at Sarah's frightened but determined face, he knew his life had just become infinitely more complicated. The question was, what was he going to do about it? Alexander Reed had built his empire on careful calculation and risk assessment. Every investment, every business move was thoroughly analyzed before execution. But as he sat in his study, looking at the evidence Sarah had brought and the fear in her eyes, he knew he had to make a decision that went beyond business logic. "You'll stay here," he said finally, his voice firm. "My home has excellent security, and no one would think to look for you here. We'll figure out how to handle this situation properly." The relief on Sarah's face was palpable, but she quickly sobered. "It's dangerous," she warned. "These people, they're powerful. They won't stop until they get the evidence and silence anyone who knows about it." "I'm powerful too," Alexander replied, a steel entering his voice. "And unlike them, I don't have to hide in the shadows." With that decision, Alexander set in motion a series of events that would have far-reaching consequences. The first order of business was to ensure Sarah's safety. He called his head of security, former Special Forces operative Mike Dawson, and briefed him on the situation. Next, he began the delicate process of disentangling his firm from Quantum Dynamics. This proved more complicated than expected. The companies were intertwined through various investments and partnerships, and any sudden moves would raise red flags. The consequences of his decision became apparent almost immediately. Marcus Sterling called within days, his friendly demeanor barely masking his suspicion. "Alex, heard you're pulling back from some of our joint ventures," Sterling said smoothly. "Any particular reason?" "Diversifying our portfolio," Alexander replied, matching Sterling's tone. "Nothing personal, just business." The conversation ended amicably enough, but Alexander knew he had just made a powerful enemy. His instincts were confirmed when unusual activities began occurring around his firm. Subtle cyber attacks, suspicious inquiries from regulatory bodies, whispered rumors in industry circles. His board of directors called an emergency meeting, concerned about the company's sudden change in direction. Alexander found himself fighting battles on multiple fronts, trying to protect both his company and Sarah while gathering enough evidence to expose Quantum Dynamics' fraud. The personal consequences were equally challenging. His carefully ordered life dissolved into chaos. His mansion, once a showcase of minimalist luxury, was transformed into a kind of high-end safe house. Sarah's presence brought both warmth and complications to his daily routine. His social life, already limited, became even more restricted. He canceled appearances at charity events and declined dinner invitations, knowing that any public exposure could put Sarah at risk. The media began speculating about his sudden reclusiveness, generating headlines like "Modern Midas goes into hiding" and "Reed's Empire, Trouble in Paradise." The strain began to show in various ways. Alexander found himself sleeping less, working more, constantly looking over his shoulder. He installed additional security systems, changed his routines, and began carrying a concealed weapon, something he had never felt the need to do before. Yet amid these challenges, Alexander discovered something unexpected. For the first time in years, he felt truly alive. The comfortable numbness that had settled over his life was gone, replaced by a sense of purpose that went beyond mere wealth accumulation. One evening, as he watched Sarah helping Mrs. Chen prepare dinner, she had insisted on being useful, Alexander realized that his decision had changed more than just his external circumstances. It had shifted something fundamental within him. The consequences of his choice continued to ripple outward. Old business associates began distancing themselves, unsure of which side to take in the growing conflict. But others, particularly those who had their own suspicions about quantum dynamics, quietly offered support. His relationship with his staff deepened as they were drawn into the situation. Mrs. Chen, initially wary of Sarah's presence, became fiercely protective of the young woman. Mike Dawson's role evolved from security chief to trusted confidant. Perhaps the most significant consequence was the way Alexander's priorities began to shift. The pursuit of profit, which had driven him for so long, took a backseat to something more meaningful: the protection of an innocent life and the pursuit of justice. As he sat in his study late one night, reviewing security footage and financial documents, Alexander reflected on how a simple act of kindness, stopping for a hitchhiker in the rain, had completely upended his life. Yet despite the dangers and complications, he knew he would make the same choice again. The modern Midas was learning that some things were worth more than gold, and that the most important decisions in life rarely made sense on a balance sheet. The consequences of his choice were still unfolding, but Alexander Reed was beginning to understand that sometimes the highest cost came with the greatest reward. While Alexander and Sarah focused on gathering evidence against quantum dynamics, a secondary plot began to unfold within the walls of the Hampton estate. Mrs. Chen, who had served as Alexander's housekeeper for over a decade, found herself becoming increasingly involved in their situation. Born in Hong Kong and trained as a journalist before immigrating to America, Mrs. Chen had always been more than just a housekeeper. She had a sharp mind and an observer's eye that had served her well over the years. Now, these skills were being put to unexpected use. She began noticing patterns in the people who came and went from the estate: certain delivery vehicles that lingered too long, unfamiliar cars that passed by too frequently. Her suspicions were confirmed when she caught a man attempting to pose as a meter reader, his questions too probing to be innocent. Instead of taking her concerns directly to Alexander, who was already overwhelmed, Mrs. Chen established her own network of information. She befriended the other household staff in neighboring estates, creating an informal neighborhood watch. Through their gossip and observations, she began piecing together a picture of the surveillance operation being mounted against them. One evening, as she served tea to Sarah in the kitchen, Mrs. Chen decided to share her own story. She told Sarah about her days as a journalist in Hong Kong, investigating corruption until it became too dangerous to continue. She understood what it meant to run from powerful enemies. Sometimes, she said, pouring the tea with practiced grace, the most important stories are the ones that cost the most to tell. This connection between the two women added another layer to the household dynamic. Mrs. Chen began teaching Sarah the art of observation, how to spot surveillance, how to blend in and become invisible when necessary. These lessons, born from Mrs. Chen's years of experience, would prove invaluable. Meanwhile, Mike Dawson, the head of security, was conducting his own investigation. A former Special Forces operative, he had contacts in various intelligence agencies. Through these connections, he began uncovering disturbing links between quantum dynamics and several suspicious deaths besides Sarah's father. The secondary plot served to deepen the main narrative, showing how the ripple effects of Alexander's decision to help Sarah had created a network of allies within his household. What had started as a simple act of kindness had evolved into a complex operation involving multiple players, each bringing their own skills and experiences to bear. Mrs. Chen's involvement expanded beyond just gathering intelligence. She began using her cooking skills as a cover for meetings with other household staff in the area, organizing what appeared to be innocent recipe exchanges that were actually intelligence-gathering sessions. Her kitchen became a hub of information, where whispered conversations over dumplings and tea revealed valuable insights about suspicious activities in the neighborhood. Mike Dawson recognized the value of Mrs. Chen's network and integrated it into his security operations. This unlikely partnership between a former Special Forces operative and a Chinese housekeeper proved remarkably effective. Their different perspectives and approaches to gathering information complemented each other perfectly. The secondary plot also revealed the human side of those involved in protecting Sarah. Mrs. Chen shared stories of her own daughter in California, seeing in Sarah a reflection of the child she rarely got to visit. Mike Dawson found himself remembering the reasons he'd joined the military in the first place: to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. As these relationships developed, the Hampton estate transformed from a luxurious but cold mansion into a warm sanctuary, where each person played a vital role in their shared mission. The secondary plot highlighted how crisis often brings out unexpected strengths in people and forges connections that might never have existed otherwise. As weeks turned into months, the relationships between the inhabitants of the Hampton estate evolved in unexpected ways. The initial awkwardness between Alexander and Sarah gave way to a comfortable familiarity, though both were careful to maintain appropriate boundaries. Their morning routine became a quiet ritual, sharing coffee in his study while reviewing news and financial reports, looking for any information that might help their case against quantum dynamics. These moments allowed them to see different sides of each other. Alexander discovered that Sarah had inherited her father's sharp analytical mind, while Sarah began to understand that there was more to Alexander than his wealthy businessman persona. "You're not what I expected," Sarah admitted one morning as they pored over financial documents. "When I first saw your magazine cover, I thought you'd be a cold-hearted capitalist?" Alexander supplied with a wry smile. "Something like that," she laughed. "Instead, you're risking everything to help a stranger." Alexander considered her words. Maybe I needed something worth risking everything for. Their relationship remained strictly platonic, both aware that anything else would be inappropriate given the circumstances. Yet there was an undeniable connection building between them. Not romance, but something equally profound. A deep trust and understanding. Mrs. Chen watched this development with approval, noting how Sarah's presence had humanized her employer. The Alexander Reed, who now helped in the kitchen and joined them for casual dinners, was a far cry from the distant figure who had barely noticed his staff before. The housekeeper's own relationship with Sarah deepened as well. Their late-night conversations in the kitchen became a source of comfort for both women. Mrs. Chen shared stories of her life in Hong Kong and her early years in America, while Sarah opened up about her father and their close relationship before his death. He always said that doing the right thing was more important than doing the safe thing. Sarah confided one night, helping Mrs. Chen fold dumplings. "I didn't understand what that meant until now." Mike Dawson's gruff exterior began to soften as well, particularly around Sarah. He took it upon himself to teach her basic self-defense, and these training sessions often turned into impromptu therapy sessions where Sarah could express her fears and frustrations. "Fear keeps you alive," he told her during one particularly difficult session, "but it shouldn't keep you from living." The relationships within the household created a support system that helped them all cope with the constant tension of their situation. They celebrated small victories together, like when they uncovered a crucial piece of evidence, and comforted each other during setbacks. Even Alexander's relationship with his staff transformed. He began to see them not as employees but as partners in their shared mission. He learned about their lives, their families, their dreams and fears. The walls of wealth and status that had separated them gradually crumbled. One evening, as they all sat around the kitchen table sharing a meal Mrs. Chen had prepared, Alexander looked at the faces around him and realized something profound. In trying to protect Sarah, he had gained something he'd never had before: a real family, not bound by blood, but by choice and circumstance. The development of these relationships proved crucial to their mission. Each person's strength helped compensate for others' weaknesses, creating a resilient network that could withstand the mounting pressure from their enemies. These bonds would be tested in the days ahead, as their adversaries grew more desperate and dangerous. But the foundation they had built, the trust, understanding, and genuine care for each other, would prove stronger than any external threat. As spring turned to summer, the inhabitants of the Hampton estate found themselves bound together by more than just their shared secret. They had become a family of sorts, each person essential to the other's survival and happiness. The relationship development between these unlikely allies would prove to be their greatest asset in the challenges that lay ahead. Though none of them could have predicted just how much they would need to rely on each other when their enemies finally made their move. The storm broke on a warm summer evening, just as they had begun to feel secure in their routine. Alexander was in his study with Sarah, reviewing new evidence they had uncovered, when Mrs. Chen burst in, her usual composure shattered. "Cars coming up the drive," she reported breathlessly. 6 of them. not regular security. Even as she spoke, the security system began blaring its warning. Mike Dawson's voice crackled over the intercom. Breach at the front gate. Armed hostiles. Multiple points of entry. Initiating Protocol Delta. Years of preparation for this moment kicked in. Alexander moved swiftly to a hidden panel in the wall, revealing a concealed safe room. "Sarah, get in, now." But Sarah stood her ground. "Not without the evidence," she insisted, grabbing her laptop and the files they'd gathered. "And not without all of you." The sound of breaking glass echoed from somewhere in the mansion. Mrs. Chen was already moving, heading for the kitchen where she'd hidden copies of their most crucial evidence in her recipe books. "Together," Alexander decided quickly. "We all go together." They made it to the safe room just as the first intruders reached the study. Through the hidden cameras, they watched as armed men in tactical gear methodically searched the mansion. Leading them was a face Alexander recognized, Marcus Sterling himself. "He's desperate," Alexander murmured. "Coming here personally. He must know we're close to exposing everything." The safe room was well stocked and secure, but they all knew it was only a temporary solution. Eventually, their enemies would find them. They needed to get their evidence out, to make it public before it was too late. Sarah was already working on her laptop, attempting to upload their files to multiple secure servers. But the connection was slow, and the progress bar seemed frozen at 60%. "They're blocking the signal," Mike explained grimly. "Military-grade jammers." The sound of destruction grew closer as the intruders tore the mansion apart looking for them. Mrs. Chen clutched her recipe book containing the backup drives to her chest, her face set with determination. "We need a distraction," she said suddenly. "Something to draw them away from this wing of the house long enough for the files to upload." Before anyone could stop her, Mrs. Chen pressed the button to open the safe room door. Alexander grabbed her arm. "What are you doing?" "Creating a story worth telling," she replied with a sad smile, then slipped out before they could stop her. Through the cameras, they watched as Mrs. Chen made her way through the mansion's secret passages. Passages she had mapped meticulously over her years of service. She emerged in the garage, setting off car alarms and triggering the sprinkler system. The plan worked. Most of the intruders rushed toward the commotion, giving Sarah's upload the boost it needed to complete. But as they watched Mrs. Chen try to escape, a shot rang out. "No," Sarah cried as their faithful housekeeper fell. The climactic moment had arrived. They had the evidence uploaded, but at what cost? And now they faced an impossible choice: stay hidden and safe, or emerge to help Mrs. Chen, who had sacrificed herself for their cause. Alexander looked at the faces around him, seeing his own anguish reflected in their eyes. The next few minutes would determine not just their fate, but the fate of everyone involved in this conspiracy. The time for hiding was over. Now they had to fight back. Alexander was the first to move, his hand reaching for the safe room door. "Mike, get Sarah and the evidence out through the tunnel. I'm going after Mrs. Chen." "No," Sarah protested. "We go together. That's what we decided." "The evidence is uploaded," Mike interjected, checking his tablet. "It's spreading across multiple platforms. News agencies are already picking it up. Sterling can't stop it now." This news seemed to reach Sterling and his men at the same moment. Through the security cameras, they watched as he received a phone call that made his face contort with rage. Alexander made a swift decision. New plan. "Mike, trigger the house defense systems. All of them. Sarah, call your contact at the FBI. Mrs. Chen needs medical attention, and we need to end this now." The next few minutes were chaos. Mike activated the mansion's state-of-the-art security measures, filling certain sections with smoke, triggering strobe lights, and creating a disorienting environment for the intruders. Alexander and Mike used this confusion to make their way to Mrs. Chen, while Sarah coordinated with law enforcement from the safe room. They found Mrs. Chen conscious, but bleeding from a shoulder wound. The bullet had gone clean through, and while painful, it wasn't life-threatening. "Did it work?" were her first words. "Did we get them?" "Yes," Alexander assured her, applying pressure to her wound. "Thanks to you, we did it." The sound of sirens began to fill the air. Local police first, then the distinctive sound of federal vehicles. Sterling and his men found themselves trapped between the mansion's security systems and approaching law enforcement. What followed was a tense standoff. Sterling, realizing he was cornered, took a desperate gamble. He used his phone to make one last call, attempting to activate his political connections. But it was too late. The evidence of quantum dynamics crimes was already viral, spreading across social media and news outlets worldwide. In a final attempt at resolution, Alexander used the mansion's intercom system to address Sterling directly. "It's over, Marcus. The truth is out. Your only chance now is to surrender and cooperate with the authorities." For a moment, it seemed Sterling might choose violence over surrender. But as FBI agents surrounded the mansion and news helicopters appeared overhead, the fight seemed to leave him. His men lowered their weapons, and the raid that had begun with such violence ended with a series of quiet arrests. Mrs. Chen was taken to the hospital, insisted on by Alexander despite her protests that she could walk it off. Sarah accompanied her, refusing to leave the woman who had risked her life for them. As the authorities began processing the scene, Alexander found himself standing in his ruined study, surveying the damage. Mike appeared at his side, looking equally exhausted but satisfied. "You know," Mike said, "when you hired me to handle security, I didn't think it would involve taking down a corporate conspiracy." Alexander managed a tired smile. "When I picked up a hitchhiker in the rain, I didn't think it would lead to all this." The immediate danger was over, but they all knew the real work of resolution was just beginning. There would be trials, testimonies, and the long process of bringing everyone involved in the conspiracy to justice. Sterling's arrest was just the beginning. His political connections and corporate allies would need to be investigated and exposed. Alexander's own company would need careful attention. The revelation of quantum dynamics crimes and his role in exposing them would have far-reaching implications for his business relationships and investments. Yet as he watched Sarah helping the FBI agents collect evidence, her face set with determination, Alexander knew they had made the right choice. Mrs. Chen's sacrifice had ensured that David Foster's death would not go unpunished, and that the truth he died trying to expose would finally come to light. The resolution wasn't perfect. The mansion was damaged, Mrs. Chen was injured, and they had all been changed by the experience. But they had faced the conflict together and emerged victorious. As the sun began to rise over the Hampton estate, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Alexander realized that this resolution marked not an ending, but a beginning. They had won the battle, but the war against corporate corruption and greed would continue. And somehow, he knew that the unlikely family forged in this crisis would face it together. Sarah caught his eye across the room and gave him a tired smile. In that moment, Alexander understood that sometimes the best resolutions don't tie everything up neatly, but rather open the door to new possibilities and better ways of living. The weeks following the confrontation at the mansion marked a significant turning point for everyone involved. The media dubbed it the quantum scandal, and it became one of the biggest corporate fraud exposés of the decade. For Alexander, it represented a complete shift in his life's direction. His reputation transformed from that of a ruthless businessman to a corporate whistleblower who had risked his fortune to protect the truth. He decided to leverage this change, restructuring his investment firm to focus on ethical business practices and corporate accountability. "The modern Midas is dead," he announced at a press conference. "It's time for a new approach to wealth and success." Sarah, no longer in hiding, became a prominent advocate for corporate whistleblowers. She established a foundation in her father's name, providing support and protection for others who dared to expose corruption. The shy, frightened woman Alexander had picked up in the rain had become a powerful voice for change. Mrs. Chen, after recovering from her injury, refused Alexander's offer to retire with a generous pension. Instead, she accepted a new role as the foundation's operations director, bringing her keen observational skills and quiet wisdom to their continued mission. The Hampton estate, once a symbol of Alexander's solitary wealth, was transformed as well. The damage from the raid was repaired, but Alexander took the opportunity to make other changes. The cold showpiece rooms became warm, lived-in spaces. The kitchen, Mrs. Chen's domain, became the heart of their operations. Mike Dawson stayed on, expanding his role beyond security to help train other whistleblowers in personal protection and surveillance detection. His military experience found a new purpose in protecting those who fought against corporate corruption. Together, they forged a new direction for their lives, one that combined Alexander's business acumen, Sarah's passion for justice, Mrs. Chen's wisdom, and Mike's protective instincts. The mansion became not just a home, but a headquarters for their shared mission. This turning point represented more than just a change in career paths or living arrangements. It marked a fundamental shift in how they viewed success, safety, and family. The bonds forged during their time of crisis had created something rare and valuable, a chosen family united by purpose and mutual trust. As Alexander watched Sarah and Mrs. Chen working together in his study, now filled with both business reports and Mrs. Chen's home-cooked meals, he realized that his life had finally found the meaning it had been lacking. The modern Midas had learned that true wealth couldn't be measured in gold, but in the connections we forge and the differences we make in others' lives. As autumn settled over the Hamptons, bringing with it crisp air and changing leaves, each member of their unlikely family found themselves reflecting on their journey and the ways it had changed them. Alexander, once defined solely by his ability to generate wealth, discovered a deeper purpose in using that wealth for positive change. His growth was evident in the small things, the way he now took time to really listen to others, his willingness to put relationships before profits, and his newfound ability to find joy in simple moments shared with his makeshift family. "I spent years thinking success meant having the most," he confided to Mrs. Chen one evening as they sat in the kitchen. "Now I realize it means doing the most good with what you have." Sarah's transformation was equally profound. The frightened young woman running from danger had become a confident advocate for justice. She carried her father's legacy forward not through fear and revenge, but through positive action and change. Working with other whistleblowers through their foundation, Sarah found herself sharing the wisdom she had gained. Sometimes, she would tell them, the hardest path is the one that leads us exactly where we need to be. Mrs. Chen's brush with death had reinforced her belief in the power of small acts of courage. Her role in their victory had given her a renewed sense of purpose, proving that one person's actions, no matter how seemingly insignificant, could tip the scales toward justice. She took particular pride in mentoring young activists, sharing not just her tactical wisdom, but her philosophy of patient resistance. "Change," she would say, "is like making good dumplings. It takes time, attention to detail, and many hands working together." Mike Dawson, who had spent his career seeing the worst in people, found his cynicism softened by the courage and integrity he had witnessed. His military training had prepared him to protect people physically, but he learned to appreciate the importance of protecting their spirits as well. The growth they experienced individually was magnified by their connections to each other. They had learned that true strength comes not from standing alone, but from standing together. Their differences, which might once have kept them apart, became complementary strengths in their shared mission. Regular family dinners in the kitchen became a time for sharing not just meals, but reflections on their ongoing work. These moments of connection reminded them of how far they had come and helped them maintain their sense of purpose. One evening, as they sat around the kitchen table, Sarah raised her glass in a toast. "To the rainy night that brought us together," she said, looking at Alexander with gratitude. "To Mrs. Chen's dumplings, which kept us going through the tough times," Alexander added, making the housekeeper smile. "To justice, which takes many forms," Mike contributed. "To family," Mrs. Chen concluded simply, encompassing them all in her warm gaze. Their growth, both individual and collective, continued to shape their work and relationships. They had learned that change was not a destination, but a journey, and that the greatest growth often came from the most challenging circumstances. As they looked toward the future, they carried with them the lessons learned through their shared experience. That courage comes in many forms, that family can be found in unexpected places, and that true wealth lies not in what we possess, but in what we give to others. A year after the rainy night that brought them together, Alexander hosted a different kind of gathering at the Hampton estate. The mansion's gates, once symbols of isolation, stood open to welcome whistleblowers, activists, and advocates from around the world. In the garden, where armed men had once searched for them, people now shared stories of courage and transformation. The kitchen where Mrs. Chen had hidden crucial evidence now nourished both bodies and spirits, as she served her famous dumplings to those seeking guidance and support. Standing at the podium to address the gathering, Alexander looked at the faces before him. Sarah, strong and purposeful. Mrs. Chen, wise and serene. Mike, vigilant but smiling. His makeshift family had grown to include countless others united by their commitment to truth and justice. A year ago, he began, I thought wealth meant having the most money, the biggest house, the most impressive portfolio. But true wealth, I've learned, is found in the connections we make and the differences we create in others' lives. The themes that had defined their journey resonated through his words. The power of unexpected connections, the strength found in standing together, and the transformative nature of choosing justice over safety. As the sun set over the Hamptons, painting the sky in brilliant colors, Alexander realized that their story had become something larger than themselves. It had become a testament to the power of choice, the strength of unlikely families, and the enduring truth that one act of kindness on a rainy night could change not just a life, but the world. The modern Midas had finally learned that the most valuable things in life couldn't be measured in gold, but in the courage to do what's right and the love we share with others.